Hello and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 7, which centers on enterprise architecture. This is part of the ISOL 536 course on security architecture and design. As always, my name is Dr. Alan Dennis. I am your instructor. Chapter 7 centers on enterprise architecture. We begin the discussion with some pre-work associated with a fictional organization. Then we'll do a threat landscape or cover the topics of a threat landscape, talk about the conceptual security architecture, enterprise security imperatives and requirements, component architecture, and then we'll conclude the chapter with enterprise architecture requirements. Moving on to other sort of topics. So whenever a security architect's dealing with enterprise architecture, it's a very strategic sort of engagement. Part of this is because of the nature of enterprise architecture. Enterprise is speaking to the entire organization, so something that spreads across not just one particular marketing or one particular department like a marketing group or something, but across the entire organization. So that means that we need to think in terms of things at a much broader level and think about the types of users that are going to be involved because we may be dealing with customers, internal analysts, customer service support, administrative staff, executives, and so on. So it's important to kind of think about this stuff from a very strategic level and consider it very seriously and with great thought. We continue our discussion by revisiting an architectural diagram that we covered in Chapter 3. Figure 7.1, as you see on the screen, is the bus-oriented architecture that we discussed previously. Take a moment and look at it. Remember this and try to think it through because we'll be speaking to this as we move forward. You may also want to open your text and turn to this chapter and this page. So when we talk about enterprise architecture, it's as much about, as this slide points out, it's about the vision, the strategy, uh, and in combination with documenting what exists today, but also looking to the future about what needs to be there tomorrow and the next day. So when we think about it from that perspective, it takes a thorough sort of analysis of the enterprise architecture to make sure that it is both something that is desirable today, but also will set us up for the future and ensure that we're able to address today's challenges as well as tomorrow's, both in terms of technology, implementations, and so on, but also from a security and threat management perspective. Whenever you're doing work related to architecture in general, it's important you understand the scenario, the context, and the organization that you're working within. If you work for that organization, it's relatively straightforward because you're consistently working for the same people. If you're a consultant, it may be different because you may be dealing with a different organization very frequently, perhaps as often even as once a week, depending upon the type of engagement you're dealing with. So because of that, it's important to keep an idea get an understanding and an idea of what it is that they do, what is the purpose of the organization, what is their space. In this case, we're talking about a fictitious company called Digital Discus, and they're all about networking, equipment. So understanding that and understanding that there's an e-commerce aspect of their organization is important so that you can actually accurately assess their needs and make recommendations. So the fact that there is e-commerce means that there is inherently a certain amount of risk associated with that endeavor. The organization is willing to undertake that risk because that's how they make their money. So it's not wise for a security person to come in and say, well, the first thing you need to do is disconnect from the internet because it's risky, right? You're not going to get very far in that conversation. So understanding what the goal of the organization is, what it is they're trying to do, is important to being able to help them succeed and to be able to balance the risks that they're willing to take with the rewards that they're going to gain. And in this case, they're looking at increasing or having a substantially better mean time between failures, MTBF, so that they have a competitive advantage against other networking companies. Moving on to our discussion of the threat landscape in which Digital Discus operates. So they deal with products that have encryption. Encryption is a sensitive thing, right? Because if you're able to compromise that encryption, you may be able to compromise someone's network. And it may be that the individuals wanting to compromise those networks might be state-based agencies, right? So state-sponsored organizations who have substantial resources. These are important things to be aware of. The example on the screen is quite compelling and also concerning because it talks about the vulnerabilities that are associated with other organizations having access. So this is almost like that sort of the chain is only as strong as the weakest link metaphor that you sometimes will hear. If there is some vulnerability anywhere within the environment, then that potential vulnerability could be leveraged and taken advantage of to gain access that should not be given. So the four major classes of threat agents that this fictitious organization is concerned with are industrial spies, and those are a potentially a significant group of individuals with also substantial resources behind them, perhaps, and cyber criminals, cyber activists, and potentially privileged insiders, which are always considered a threat. When we talk about conceptual security architecture, this is about trying to get across at a very high level and oftentimes in an overly simplified way the interaction between processes within an organization's systems and what functions occur where. There is a goal to separate out applications and elements of systems into multiple layers. One of those layers is a presentation layer. As the name implies, it's about showing stuff and showing stuff in particular to people that are using those applications. While it's unlikely in most organizations that there is a single presentation layer across all applications, conceptually, all applications should have a presentation layer that is distinct from business logic, application logic, and so on. And there's motivations for doing that are pretty well established, and we've been doing it for quite a long time. You may hear the term in-tier architecture. That's where that comes from. So the underlying goal, though, is to ensure that there's no business logic, no heavy lifting going on inside of the presentation layer. All of that stuff should be done at a different layer, deeper within the application's architecture. Moving on to imperatives and requirements. We talked earlier about how that one of the actors in the threat space is industrial espionage actors, right? So the thing that's concerning about them in particular is they are potentially very patient. The stakes involved in enterprise, a hostile enterprise attempting to compromise the security of an organization are very high because it may essentially enable the competition to remove a competitive barrier that is impeding their sales. Simply put, they may attempt to steal the ideas, the designs, the plans from one organization, saving themselves a considerable amount of research and development time, and also potentially being able to identify flaws and vulnerabilities within their competitors' products, enabling them to potentially attack them either maliciously through some sort of hacking sort of experience, or through a marketing and sales perspective so that they can uh, independently find, supposedly, something that is vulnerable within their products. So we talked about in figure 7.1, the diagram which showed us the overall architecture at a conceptual level, that most of the integration occurs in kind of two places. One is the message bus, which is essentially where application to application correspondences are going on. The other is in integration systems. Knowing what each one of those things can do and what applications can do what is essential. This is almost like the same concept of least privilege from a user management perspective. But instead of it being a user, it's a system. So you can think of it as a different sort of identity. That system should only be given the access that's necessary for it to do its job. So if you have a system that maybe is a marketing sort of system, it might need to know certain information from a customer relationship management system, but it certainly wouldn't need to know anything from like a technical design repository, right? So making sure that each of the systems has access to the things it should have is important. Continuing that thought, whenever we start looking at the imperatives and requirements at a more discrete level, we come up with some kind of conceptual requirements. These may not necessarily be down to actionable, but they certainly are things that would be wanted to be noted at a high level. For example, having strict administrative access control, well, that kind of is common sense, but maybe it should be written down to ensure it's in place. Also, administrative privilege grant, when that happens, should be very rare and managed appropriately, potentially in some sort of firefighter scenarios or whatever the use case may be. Make sure that there are administrative practices in place that are robust and secure. Um, make sure monitoring and response capabilities are there, and so on. So each of these items would be identified so that you could make sure that they're handled through some sort of procedures and policies along the way. We continue our process of drilling into the architecture by moving to more of a component architecture. And we do so by taking that initial conceptual architecture we discussed in 7.1, so at the beginning of this conversation, and we drill into it a little bit. We expand it out, but we still stay at a fairly high level. You'll notice that the data stores aren't telling you what kind of data store it might be. It's just simply saying that it's a data store. So you're ignoring potentially implementation level details and so on. You're always balancing with this sort of effort enough detail that you can make the determination that's necessary at the time you're trying to do it, with the ability to understand it and to make sure it's not getting overly complex, because it's easy to flood it with information so that it's very challenging to understand and to basically make good decisions. There's also here a certain amount of kind of zones that have been identified, and things have been partitioned in a relatively straightforward way. Moving forward with this whole conversation, we then add some data flows that we can start seeing who talks to who. Uh, and there's orchestration in the mix as well, which is things where you control what something happens in response to something else. So typically there's some sort of business processes that flow that are made up of a series of steps. Sometimes those steps don't succeed, and if they don't succeed, there needs to be some means of compensating for it or rolling it back, one of those sort of things. So we have a certain amount of orchestration going on here, but not really very much, because again, you're balancing complexity with understanding. Here we can see what systems are talking to what. It's kind of interesting that some of the data systems are talking to each other. It's also interesting that some of these have quite a few lines. So you would then start kind of drilling into, well, what are these points? And also keeping in mind that each one of those points potentially is a threat vector. This is calling out that previous figure was really kind of busy and noisy. There's a lot of flows on there that are kind of making it difficult to follow who's talking to what, and it's very difficult to figure out which one it is. That's where you may end up needing to use some sort of layered approach, or something where you can essentially zoom in and zoom out. Even if you're doing so through some sort of PowerPoint based approach, you could still do it to where you only show things at a certain level. You may focus in on a particular applications data flow, or maybe sources and destinations flow. So you take one of the points that are of interest and see who all talks to it and who all it talks to, as a way that you can kind of enumerate the various flows in a way that you can present that information in a good way that is to where a person can understand it, but yet you need enough detail so that you can actually assess it. Um, so to wrap this whole concept up, You need to understand things like the threat landscape. You need to know how much risk an organization is willing to take, and what their stance on it basically is. Security architectures and principle imperatives, the major components of the system, things like identity, security, and so on, hardening of the systems, and administrative policies and standards. When we talk about requirements at an enterprise level, sometimes you'll think of these things in a fairly high level thing, saying that if the system will do this, and you leave a lot of the details to that system itself. And for example, here we're talking about the infrastructure level of an enterprise architecture, that you may just make some sort of relatively broad statements of saying there's some security services out there, and what those security services are going to do is follow what are essentially industry best standards of making sure there's firewalls, making sure that there's segmentation of networks, that there is some sort of a security operations center involved, and so on. So that rather than doing it on every individual sort of part of the enterprise architecture landscape, you say, well, this is what the entire domain of enterprise architecture looks like within this organization. And you then ensure that everyone follows those standards as well. And wrapping up our conversation around chapter 7, there's kind of some underlying themes here that are persistent or pervasive across the entire topic that hopefully you understand. As mentioned earlier, enterprise architecture, even if we're talking of security, if we're talking about just enterprise architecture from a technology perspective, it's about vision and strategy as much as it is about what exists today. It's thinking about what we want tomorrow, and it's making choices along the way that you don't regret later on, frankly. So it has to consider the things that exist today. So you very rarely will encounter a situation where you have what's considered a green field scenario. What that means is that nothing exists and you're building it from scratch. That almost never happens. There are scenarios where it can. Maybe somebody is creating a new company. Maybe they're building something from the ground up that's never been done before, but it is rarely, really rare. So you have to consider the existing stuff that lives today and those things that are going to live tomorrow. That means that there's some infrastructure that needs to be put into place to support that along the way. And hopefully everything that is being implemented is done in such a way that as it evolves and grows, things stay elegant and clean versus devolving into some sort of spaghetti-ish or um, uh, poorly organized construct. And with that, we'll conclude our discussion of Chapter 7. Thank you for listening. As always, stay safe, and we'll speak again in the future.